The Pfizer Papers, a story of silencing, haste, and blind consent. Welcome, friends of Aether Decoder. Today we're going to dive into one of the most controversial and debated topics of our time. A recently published document known as the Pfizer Papers sheds light on what many already suspected but couldn't say out loud. During the pandemic, countless voices were silenced. Any discourse that dared to go against the alignment between governments, corporate media, and pharmaceutical labs was quickly stifled. I myself wasn't able to publish even a clear warning here on the channel about the risks the population was facing with the new mRNA technology. Yes, technology, because it wasn't a traditional vaccine, but many people, even today, still don't know what that acronym means or what was actually introduced into their bodies. Most people took the shot believing it was just another dose of tried and true science, like the vaccines we've known for decades. But it wasn't. What was administered to billions of people around the world was an experimental genetic platform unprecedented on such a large scale, and the Pfizer patent alone has more than 200 pages of complex technical details. This is a far cry from being just a mere variation of previous vaccines. It is, in fact, a deep foray into cutting-edge biotechnology involving molecular manipulation and genetic engineering. If I were to use a metaphor, it would be like boarding the first rocket to the moon without knowing if the bolts were tightened, and, even more seriously, without having been informed about it. I want to take this moment to remind you of the importance of seeking out doctors and integrative professionals who are truly committed to real health, who can assess your individual history and, if necessary, guide you toward treatments that help mitigate the impacts of this technology on your body. There are serious protocols being studied, including those regarding the possible neutralization of the spike protein, which remains active in many vaccinated individuals. I can't say more than that, because this so-called science, with a dollar sign in front, acts like a hungry hyena. It attacks anyone who strays from the script. But you can do your own research about what some people are calling the universal antidote. Do this calmly, responsibly, and with a critical mind. So, buckle up, because today we're taking off. And it won't be with fossil fuel. Our ship is powered by scalar fields of consciousness and will break through the boundaries of hypocrisy, manipulation, and human greed. Welcome to the journey. Introduction. When the world plunged into the global panic caused by COVID-19, the scientific community and governments found themselves in a desperate race to contain the spread of the virus. It was the beginning of 2020, and fear was taking over societies. Entire cities were locked down, flights suspended, economies brought to a halt. The proposed solution seemed clear: a vaccine. And the faster, the better. Driven by this urgency, the world was introduced to an unprecedented promise: vaccines developed with a new technology called mRNA, which would be safe, effective, and delivered in record time. This promise, however, did not come with a transparent debate. What followed was one of the greatest crackdowns on free scientific inquiry in recent history. From the very beginning, any doubt or criticism regarding the speed of vaccine development or the safety of their ingredients was labeled as denialism. Experts, doctors, journalists, and ordinary citizens who dared to raise questions, many of them legitimate, were silenced, demonetized, banned from social media, and in some cases, legally persecuted. The hegemonic discourse imposed by big pharmaceutical companies, governments, and media outlets repeated, like a mantra, that the vaccines were safe and effective, and that doubting this was an act of social irresponsibility. Science, which by definition is the exercise of methodical skepticism and constant revision, was treated as dogma. The press kept repeating, "Trust the science," as if science were a static and infallible monument and not a field in constant revision. In this way, the official narrative became a fortress and debate a minefield. But there was something deeply troubling. The vaccine approval process was drastically shortened. Regulatory agencies like the FDA, the United States Food and Drug Administration, used emergency procedures to allow products like Pfizer's to be distributed on a massive scale, even without long-term studies. Data that would normally take years to collect was considered sufficient after just a few months. Amid this acceleration, the safeguards required in any pharmaceutical development were relaxed or simply ignored. Clinical trials, which are normally subject to independent and lengthy reviews, were conducted in extremely short time frames. And, most seriously, internal documents from Pfizer itself, kept secret at the insistence of the company and the American Regulatory Agency, indicate that the manufacturers themselves were aware of a series of serious adverse effects from the very first months of vaccination. These documents were only made public after a court order and began to be studied by independent groups of experts. The material analyzed in the book Pfizer Papers, the result of the Daily Clout project with more than 300 volunteers, including doctors, lawyers, and scientific analysts, reveals a reality very different from the one sold to the public. Data from Pfizer submitted to the FDA in the first 90 days after the vaccine's launch, more than 42,000 adverse events reported, with 1,229 deaths. Myocarditis, thrombosis, neurological disorders, gynecological complications, and viral reactivation. And it's important to highlight, this was before the vaccine was released to the general public. Even in the face of these warnings, the vaccine was pushed as a mandatory condition for returning to social life. Mass vaccination campaigns, health passports, exclusion of the unvaccinated from public spaces, loss of jobs. The world was compelled to accept an unprecedented medical experiment under the banner of urgency and scientific obedience. The book analyzes, based on Pfizer's own data, how the company knew from the very beginning that the risk of adverse effects was considerable and that there were significant gaps regarding the duration of protection, transmission, and even the actual effectiveness of the vaccine. For example, among the data analyzed, there is evidence that pregnant women were vaccinated without clear protocols and that the effects on fertility, although reported, were underestimated or omitted from public communications. Children, in turn, were included in massive campaigns based on studies whose samples were insufficient to ensure any safe conclusions. The chapter on side effects reveals more than 1,000 distinct diagnoses associated with the vaccine. The very table made available in Pfizer's official document is classified as of special interest, a technical term indicating the need for rigorous investigation, but it was ignored in public communication. The consequence of this lack of transparency is still felt today. Thousands of people report post-vaccine after effects that were initially ignored or ridiculed. Doctors were forced to stop issuing exemption certificates. Families were divided, and science, once again, was used as a shield for commercial, political, and ideological interests. What the book Pfizer Papers reveals is that, behind the veneer of collective salvation, there was a game of power, omission, and profit. The documents, although written in technical language, make it clear that the company was aware of the risks involved. The choice was political, to keep the campaign going at any cost, including the human cost. Part 2. The invisibilization of risks. When opening the Pfizer documents, made public by court order, one thing stands out. The company already had detailed knowledge of a wide range of adverse effects associated with its product, right in the first months of the vaccination campaign. There were more than 42,000 cases reported to Pfizer by February 2021, including at least 1,229 deaths. These numbers are from before the vaccine's full approval, which indicates that the company and regulators already had warning signs even before the product was offered on a large scale to the global population. Among the identified adverse effects were myocarditis, pericarditis, menstrual disorders, thrombosis, neuropathies, seizures, facial paralysis, and even strokes in young people without comorbidities. The list, titled Adverse Events of Special Interest, included more than 1,000 different diagnoses. Despite this avalanche of data, the message conveyed to society was unequivocal: the vaccine is safe and effective. The terms very rare and isolated events were repeated endlessly by health authorities, while Pfizer continued to sign multi-billion-dollar contracts with governments, including confidentiality clauses and complete exemption from civil liability for any potential side effects. The document released by the Daily Clout Project reveals that the company deliberately concealed the frequency and context of many of the recorded effects, grouped symptoms together to minimize the numerical impact, and, in some cases, reclassifying events as unrelated to the vaccine, even when they occurred within a time frame compatible with the administration of the vaccine. Another disturbing fact concerns the vaccination of pregnant women. The documents indicate that the product was administered to pregnant women with limited safety data and without robust prior trials in pregnancy, even in the face of evidence of complications such as spontaneous abortions, hemorrhages, premature births, and fetal development problems. Even so, the official communication did not reflect these risks, and many pregnant women were encouraged to take the vaccine as a protective measure. The same applies to children and adolescents. Pfizer acknowledges in its own data that the initial studies on minors involved extremely small samples and very short-term follow-up, which makes it impossible to draw any definitive scientific conclusions about medium or long-term effects. Despite this, entire countries established mandatory vaccination campaigns in schools, requiring proof of vaccination for access to education and social activities. The ethical question, therefore, is inescapable. How can an experimental product, with inconclusive data and a growing number of recorded adverse effects, have been promoted as a condition for participating in society? How can science, which is based on the principle of systematic doubt, have been hijacked by a narrative of infallibility imposed by corporations with direct commercial interests? The answer lies in the power structure and the promiscuous relationship between the pharmaceutical industry and regulatory agencies. The book Pfizer Papers exposes how Pfizer executives maintained close and frequent contact with members of the Food and Drug Administration, and how many regulatory officials moved directly into executive positions at Pfizer itself after leaving their public posts. A clear case of the revolving door. Furthermore, Pfizer demanded, in several contracts with countries like Brazil, Argentina, and South Africa, extremely strict confidentiality clauses, even requiring sovereign guarantees in the event of future lawsuits. In other words, governments were forced to accept that if something went wrong, the burden would fall on the state and not on the company. This model of legal immunity reinforces the assessment that the global population was subjected to large-scale experimentation, without full consent and without transparency about the real risks. And even more seriously, when doctors began reporting cases of patients with severe post-vaccination symptoms, they started being attacked, discredited, and even persecuted by their professional boards. The repression of scientific debate became brutal. Doctors with decades of clinical experience were suspended for expressing doubts about the safety of the product. Researchers who published studies pointing out anomalies in the efficacy data were labeled as deniers. In countries like Australia, Canada, and the United Kingdom, there were even cases of arbitrary arrests and the revocation of medical licenses. At the same time, corporate media and social networks implemented content suppression algorithms, misinformation labels, and summary removals against any content that questioned the official narrative. The hashtag vaccine save lives was promoted on all platforms, while stories of people injured or who died after immunization were deleted or hidden by search systems. At no point was society invited to independently reflect on the risk-benefit of a new technology applied directly to millions of human bodies. The mRNA technology, which consists of inducing the body itself to produce a viral protein, had never before been approved on a large scale for use in humans until then. The COVID-19 vaccines were the first official use of such a technique, and even today, in 2025, there are no conclusive studies about its long-term safety. What the book Pfizer Papers does is document, based on the company's own records, how risk data was downplayed, how ethical protocols were disregarded, and how regulatory institutions gave in to the logic of profit and emergency politics. The truth that emerges is disturbing. The world population was the subject of a vaccination campaign based on marketing and coercion, not on solid science. And when the consequences began to appear, the system responded with censorship, institutional violence, and corporate impunity. Part 3: The Lasting Lesson. The COVID-19 pandemic was not just a health crisis. It was also a brutal test of the integrity of institutions, governments, corporations, and, above all, the relationship between science and society. At the heart of this test was the promise of a quick solution. The vaccines developed in record time. But what followed was a process filled with ethical violations, deliberate omissions, data manipulation, and the silencing of dissenting voices. Pfizer, as shown in documents analyzed by the Daily Cloud Project, was not only aware of substantial risks related to its product, but also built a legal and institutional framework that shielded the company from any legal accountability. Liability waiver clauses were demanded from dozens of countries. Some of them stipulated that states would have to pay compensation in the event of serious adverse effects and prohibited the disclosure of contract details for decades. These agreements were signed under pressure during a moment of global panic and with a complete lack of transparency before the public. As a result, an unprecedented situation was created. An experimental product, with incomplete data and known risks, was made mandatory for participation in social life, while its manufacturers were legally protected from any consequences. The burden of experimentation was entirely shifted onto the citizens, who often didn't even know they were taking part in a large-scale experiment. This reversal of responsibility marks a milestone in institutional degradation. Informed consent, which is a cornerstone of any ethical medical practice, was replaced by coercion, blackmail, and fear. Those who refused to take the vaccine out of caution, due to medical history or personal conviction, were treated as social outcasts. They lost their jobs, were banned from traveling, and were harassed by public authorities and even by the general public, who had been convinced that the enemy was the unvaccinated, not the virus. This process of social division was not spontaneous. It was encouraged by official campaigns, paid influencers, and algorithms that amplified only one narrative. Science was turned into a tool for obedience, and any dissenting voice was treated as a threat to order. This was not the first time in history that this has happened. Eugenics was, in its time, considered respectable science. Radiation tests on civilians were promoted under the label of medical advancement. The tobacco industry funded research for decades to hide the risks of smoking. And all these falsehoods shared the same ingredient: the alliance between corrupted science, political power, and economic interests. The episode of COVID-19 falls into this same pattern and may eventually come to be recognized as one of the greatest ethical and scientific scandals of the 21st century. But for that to happen, the truth must continue to be pursued, even in the face of censorship, ridicule, and attempts at historical erasure. The book Pfizer Papers is a contribution in this regard. It demonstrates, based on the company's own internal data, that there was prior knowledge of the risks, deliberate omission of critical information, and manipulation of public perception through aggressive marketing and institutional complicity. More than just a technical document, the book is a warning. It shows us that blind trust in authorities, no matter how well-intentioned they may seem, is always dangerous. That science must be constantly questioned, audited, and debated in public. That freedom of expression, even in times of crisis, is not a luxury, it's a basic condition for the truth to emerge. The lesson we are left with is harsh, but necessary. We must never again submit ourselves to scientific experimentation without full knowledge of the risks, without real consent, and without the possibility to say no. No government, no company, no international agency can have absolute power over people's bodies. Medicine is, or should be, a pact between conscious human beings, based on transparency, empathy, and freedom. What happened during the pandemic broke that pact, and it is up to us to rebuild it with truth, courage, and memory. This documentary is an invitation to reflect, not to deny science, but to reclaim it so that science is never again used as a shield for tyranny, and so that the next crisis finds citizens who are more aware, freer, and more willing to say enough.